On the night of my 29th birthday, 3 days before Christmas, my sister transferred exactly $187, 430.62 out of a business account that didn't legally belong to her. I didn't stop her. I just sat across the restaurant table, smiled, and blew out the candle on a dessert I had paid for with the last $42 in my checking account. At that moment, she still believed she had won. And for almost 6 months after that night, I let her believe it. If you've ever had someone smile at you while quietly stealing your future, you already know how cold that kind of silence feels. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments, have you ever stayed quiet when someone crossed a line you couldn't forgive? And if stories about quiet revenge and emotional justice resonate with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. My name is Vanessa Cole. At the time all of this began, I was 28 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona, working as a mobile pet groomer. Not glamorous, not respected, but it paid my bills, and more importantly, it gave me something my family never could: independence. I spent my days driving a white van with faded blue paw prints down the side, washing anxious golden retrievers, and trimming the claws of tiny trembling chihuahuas. My hands always smelled faintly of oatmeal shampoo. My knees ached constantly from kneeling on van floors. It wasn't the life my parents had imagined for me, but it was mine, and that mattered. My younger sister, Danielle Cole, had always lived a very different life. She was 25, polished, ambitious, and effortlessly charming in the way people often mistake for kindness. Danielle didn't clean dog hair out of drains. She worked in client relations at a mid-tier real estate firm downtown, which was a polite way of saying she dressed well, spoke smoothly, and knew how to make wealthy people feel admired. Our parents adored her. They called her our success story. They called me resourceful. There's a difference. The business account she emptied that night had once belonged to our mother. 2 years earlier, when Mom was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's, she asked me, not Danielle, to help her manage her small but meaningful side income. Mom sold handmade ceramic pieces online. Nothing fancy, but she had built a quiet following over 15 years. Every sale mattered to her because it meant she was still capable. She trusted me to handle her orders, track expenses, and keep the account organized. Danielle had never shown interest in it until the day Mom's condition worsened. That was when everything started shifting in ways I didn't understand yet. 6 months before my birthday dinner, Danielle suggested something that sounded completely reasonable at the time. "We should consolidate Mom's finances," she said casually over coffee. "Make it simpler. One joint account for family oversight." She said it with concern in her voice. Spreadsheets open on her tablet, numbers highlighted in soft pastel colors. She sounded responsible. She sounded professional. She sounded like someone who cared. And because I was tired, overwhelmed, and juggling vet appointments, medication schedules, and a business I ran from a van, agreed to add her as a secondary authorized user. Not a co-owner, just authorized to help monitor transactions. That distinction would become very important later. But I didn't know that yet. At first, nothing changed. Danielle didn't touch the account for weeks. She even praised me during family dinners, telling our parents, "Vanessa's been amazing, handling everything." I don't know how she does it. I remember feeling something close to relief when she said that. Like maybe finally she saw me. That feeling didn't last. 3 months later, I noticed small withdrawals. Nothing dramatic. $300 here, $800 there, each labeled vaguely as operational adjustments. When I asked Danielle about them, she laughed lightly. "Oh, I just moved some funds temporarily to cover a short-term investment opportunity," she said. "I'll return it with profit. You'll see." She said it so confidently that questioning her felt almost embarrassing. Like I would be admitting I didn't understand basic financial strategy. so I let it go. That was my first mistake. The second mistake came 2 months later, when she suggested we meet for my birthday dinner at an upscale steakhouse she chose. Danielle never offered to pay for anything, but that night she insisted. "You deserve something nice," she said, smiling. I should have known. That smile always meant something was about to be taken, not given. Halfway through the dinner, her phone buzzed repeatedly. She glanced down at it, fingers moving quickly across the screen. I remember noticing the reflection of the restaurant's warm lights in her eyes as she typed. And I remember the exact moment she looked up at me and said, "Oh, by the way, I moved Mom's account funds into a higher yield portfolio today. It's safer, long term." She said it like she was telling me she'd ordered dessert. Casual, final, non-negotiable. My stomach dropped instantly. "How much did you move?" I asked. She sipped her wine before answering. "All of it." The word felt like ice sliding down my spine. All I repeated quietly. "Don't worry," she said, smiling again. "It's under my management now. It'll grow faster this way. You should actually thank me." I didn't say anything after that. Not because I agreed, not because I trusted her, but because something inside me, something very quiet and very cold, was already calculating, already observing, already realizing one thing very clearly. Danielle hadn't just taken money, she had crossed a legal boundary she didn't fully understand. And she had done it while assuming I was too small, too soft, too resourceful to fight back. So I blew out my birthday candle. I smiled, and I let her believe she had just secured her future, because she had no idea. The 2 days before that dinner, I had already received an email from the bank's fraud compliance department asking a single, very specific question about her recent access activity. A question I hadn't answered yet, and a question that would change everything. 2 mornings after my birthday, at exactly 8:12 a.m., I watched Danielle spend $6.400 from our mother's account on a diamond tennis bracelet. I didn't freeze the transaction. I didn't call the bank. I simply took a screenshot and filed it into a folder labeled Timing. If you've ever seen someone dig their own hole while smiling, you know how strange it feels to stay silent. Tell me, honestly, would you have confronted her immediately, or would you have waited to understand the full picture first? The email from the bank's fraud compliance department had arrived 3 days before my birthday dinner. The subject line read, "Unusual authorization activity review required." At the time, I was sitting in my grooming van outside a client's house, brushing out the tangled fur of a senior golden retriever named Murphy. Murphy's owner, a retired accountant named Mr. Douglas Hartman, had stepped outside to bring me coffee while I checked my phone. I remember staring at the email for a full minute before opening it. The language was calm, clinical, precise. It stated that a secondary authorized user, Danielle, had initiated a full transfer of funds into an external investment portfolio not previously linked to the account. It also stated something that made my pulse slow instead of speed up. Please confirm whether this authorization was explicitly approved by the primary account manager. Not co-owner, not joint holder, primary account manager. That was me. I didn't reply. Instead, I closed my phone and finished brushing Murphy's fur, because in that moment, something clicked in a way it never had before. Danielle hadn't just moved money. She had acted as if she had legal control she didn't actually possess. And more importantly, the bank already knew it looked suspicious. I spent the rest of that day in a strange calm, driving from house to house, trimming nails, washing dogs, and quietly thinking. Danielle had always been smarter than me, in ways people could see presentation networking confidence. But she had one blind spot. She believed charm could substitute for structure. She understood how to persuade people. She didn't understand systems. And financial systems don't respond to charm. They respond to documentation. That night, after I got home, I logged into the account and started reviewing every transaction she had made since becoming an authorized user. The pattern was clearer than I expected. At first, small test withdrawals, then slightly larger ones, then transfers labeled vaguely enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, and finally, the full liquidation and move into an external brokerage account registered under a management authorization she had signed herself. Not Mom, not me. Herself. That was the moment I realized something else. Danielle hadn't just crossed a boundary. She believed she had covered it well enough that no one would ever question it. That belief would become her biggest mistake. I created a digital folder on my laptop that night. I named it simply Timeline. Inside it, I saved everything. Bank statements, transaction logs, email notifications, even the metadata attached to each transfer. I didn't touch the money. I didn't alert Danielle. I didn't even tell our parents, because reacting emotionally would have given her time to adjust her story. And Danielle was very, very good at storytelling. I had watched her do it my entire life. She could reshape facts within minutes if given warning. So I gave her none. 3 days after my birthday dinner, she called me while I was cleaning my van. Her voice sounded bright, relaxed. "Hey, quick question," she said. "Mom mentioned she wants to order more clay supplies soon. Can you just use your personal card? For now, the investment funds are locked for a few weeks." Locked. The word landed quietly in my mind, not because of what it meant financially, but because of what it revealed psychologically. Danielle wasn't planning to return the money anytime soon. She was treating it as if it were already hers. I wiped soap off my hands and leaned against the van door. "Sure," I said calmly. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, like she had expected resistance. "You're not upset?" she asked carefully. That question told me everything. She was waiting for confrontation. She was prepared to defend herself if necessary. But she wasn't prepared for agreement. "No," I said simply. "I trust you." The silence that followed was longer this time. Then she laughed lightly. "Good. You should." That was the moment I realized something that changed how I saw the situation completely. Danielle didn't see me as an opponent. She saw me as background noise. Predictable, passive, harmless. And when someone sees you that way, they reveal far more than they intend. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched her behavior closely. Not by spying, just by paying attention. She started posting more on social media. Designer handbags, upscale dinners, weekend trips to Scottsdale, all framed carefully as work networking. But the timing of each purchase aligned perfectly with withdrawals from the brokerage account she had moved Mom's funds into. One evening, while scrolling through her public Instagram stories, I saw her laughing at a rooftop bar holding a champagne glass. The caption read, "Hard work finally paying off." That line stayed with me longer than anything else, because it wasn't just a lie. It was a belief. She genuinely felt entitled to what she had taken, and that belief made her reckless. Recklessness creates evidence. I continued documenting quietly, not confronting, not accusing, just building a complete, undeniable timeline. Because I understood something very clearly by then. This wasn't going to be resolved through family conversations. It was going to end in one of 2 ways. Either Danielle would realize what she had done and correct it voluntarily, or someone outside the family system would step in. And once that happened, no one, not even our parents, would be able to protect her from the consequences. About 3 weeks after my birthday, the bank sent a second email. Shorter this time, more direct. It read, "Final notice. We require written confirmation from the primary account manager within 14 days regarding the legitimacy of recent transfers. Failure to respond may result in a formal investigation." 14 days. I didn't respond immediately because something else had just happened that made the situation far more complicated than simple financial misconduct. That same evening, while helping Mom organize her medication schedule, she said something quietly that made my chest tighten. "I'm glad Danielle finally stepped up," she whispered. "She told me she moved the money, so it would be safer from you, since you've been struggling financially. I didn't react right away, but inside, something shifted sharply into focus. Danielle hadn't just taken control of the account. She had already started rewriting the narrative, and she had done it in a way that positioned me as the risk, which meant she wasn't just protecting the money. She was preparing for a future where I would be the one blamed if anything went wrong. And that realization told me something far more dangerous than any transaction log ever could. Danielle wasn't planning to give the money back. She was planning to make sure no one believed it had ever been mine to protect in the first place. On New Year's Eve, exactly 9 days after the bank's final notice, Danielle filed a notarized statement declaring that I had mismanaged $200,000 of our mother's money. I didn't dispute it. I printed the document, placed it in a folder, and wrote one word across the top in black ink: escalation. Before I tell you what that word meant and why I didn't react the way anyone expected, let me ask you something. If someone you loved tried to rewrite reality while you were still standing inside it, would you fight loudly, or would you wait until they couldn't deny the truth anymore? That question haunted me more than anything else during those weeks. Because Danielle wasn't just stealing money anymore. She was building a story. And stories, when repeated often enough inside families, can become more powerful than facts. The notarized statement arrived in the mail in a thin, official-looking envelope. It had her full name typed cleanly at the top: Danielle Marie Cole. The language inside was polished and careful. It stated that she had stepped in to secure assets after discovering irregular management practices by me, Vanessa Cole. It claimed she had acted to protect the long-term financial interests of our mother. It even included a line that made my hands go cold when I read it. Primary manager demonstrated signs of financial distress and instability. Financial distress, instability. Those words weren't accidental. They were legal framing. They were meant to plant doubt before anyone even asked questions. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the document for a long time. Not crying, not angry, just very still. Because something became painfully clear in that moment. Danielle wasn't improvising anymore. She was executing a plan, and plans like that don't appear overnight. They build slowly, quietly, step by step. Looking back, I can see now that she had likely started laying this groundwork months before she moved the money. The small withdrawals, the gradual narrative shifts with our parents, the subtle comments about my unstable income. She had been preparing for this exact moment. And if I reacted emotionally now, I would be stepping directly into the role she had designed for me. So I didn't react. Instead, I did something much simpler. I drove to the bank branch listed on the fraud email and requested a formal transaction history audit. Not an informal review, an official audit request. There's a difference. An audit creates a permanent institutional record, and institutional records don't care about family dynamics. They care about signatures, timestamps, and authorization levels. The bank manager who handled my request was a calm, middle-aged woman named Patricia Ellison. She spoke in the measured tone of someone used to navigating sensitive disputes. When she reviewed the account structure, she paused for a moment longer than expected. Then she said something quietly that changed everything about how I understood the situation. "Miss Cole," she said, "your sister was granted limited viewing and assistance privileges. She was never granted transfer authority." Never granted transfer authority. I already knew that. But hearing it stated formally by someone outside my family system made it real in a way nothing else had. Patricia continued gently. "The brokerage account she transferred the funds into is registered under a personal advisory authorization, not a custodial protection structure." That meant one thing very clearly. Danielle hadn't moved the money into a neutral investment vehicle for Mom's benefit. She had moved it into an account she controlled, directly, Legally traceable. That was the moment I understood something critical. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was financial misconduct, potentially criminal, and the bank already had enough documentation to prove it. But they couldn't act without my confirmation, because I was still the primary account manager. Patricia slid a single-page form across the desk toward me. It was titled Dispute Authorization Declaration. If I signed it, the bank would open a formal investigation immediately. Accounts could be frozen, external institutions notified, legal review triggered. It would escalate beyond anything Danielle or our parents could control. I held the pen above the signature line for a long time, because signing it wouldn't just expose Danielle. It would fracture our family permanently. There would be no quiet reconciliation after that. No going back to pretending everything was fine at holiday dinners. Once that process started, it would follow its own momentum. I asked Patricia one question before deciding. If I don't sign today, how long before the bank acts independently? She checked the system and answered calmly, based on the compliance timeline, likely within 30 days. 30 days. That number echoed in my mind as I left the bank, because it gave me something incredibly valuable. Time. Time to observe. Time to document further. Time to understand how far Danielle was willing to go to maintain her narrative. And most importantly, time to ensure that when the truth surfaced, it would surface completely, not partially. Because partial truth leaves room for manipulation. Full truth doesn't. Over the next 2 weeks, Danielle's behavior changed subtly. She became warmer toward me, more attentive, more publicly supportive in front of our parents, almost as if she sensed something shifting, but didn't know exactly what. One evening, she invited me to dinner at our parents' house. During the meal, she made a point of praising me repeatedly. Vanessa's always been so caring, she told Mom. She sacrifices a lot. Her tone was sweet, her smile flawless, but her eyes kept flicking toward me, searching for something. A reaction, a sign. She was trying to gauge whether I had discovered anything yet. I gave her nothing, just quiet nods, polite smiles, neutral responses, and that seemed to reassure her, because 2 days later, something happened that revealed just how confident she had become. She scheduled a family meeting, not casually, formally. She sent an email to both me and our parents with the subject line, Financial Stability Discussion, Important. Inside the email, she wrote that she wanted to clarify long-term management structures and ensure transparency moving forward. But one sentence stood out above all the others. It read, I will present documentation showing why the recent changes were necessary. Documentation. That word told me she wasn't just defending herself anymore. She believed she had enough paperwork to control the entire narrative. She believed she could prove I had been irresponsible, and that belief made her confident enough to bring everything into the open. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly realize, was that by choosing a formal setting, she was about to step directly into the one environment where documentation mattered more than persuasion. Because by the time that family meeting happened, I would no longer be the only person reviewing the evidence she planned to present. At exactly 6:03 p.m. on the night of the family meeting, Danielle walked into our parents' living room, carrying a leather folder and a printed financial summary showing a $212,000 risk exposure under my name. I didn't interrupt her presentation. I sat perfectly still on the couch, hands folded, while she calmly explained to our parents how I had supposedly endangered our mother's future. If you've ever watched someone confidently present a version of reality that you know is false, but you can't correct yet, you understand how suffocating silence can feel. Tell me, honestly, could you stay quiet while someone you loved painted you as the villain? That night, I learned something important about Danielle. She didn't just believe she was right. She believed she had already won. Our parents' house smelled faintly of cinnamon candles and lemon furniture polish. Mom sat in her recliner, hands trembling slightly, in her lap, eyes moving back and forth between us. Dad leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, watching Danielle with the same focused attention he used to give her when she showed him report cards as a child. That attention, the kind that assumed she was correct before she even spoke, had followed her entire life. Danielle stood near the coffee table like she was leading a corporate briefing, her posture straight, her voice controlled, her tone calm but firm. Before anyone reacts emotionally, she began, "I just want to show you the facts." Facts. The word landed sharply in the room. She opened her folder and laid out printed spreadsheets in neat rows across the table, color-coded, highlighted, professional-looking, designed to overwhelm. "This," she said, pointing to a chart, "shows irregular expense patterns over the past 18 months. The chart included every purchase I had ever made using the business account for Mom's ceramics operation. Clay supplies, shipping costs, kiln maintenance, packaging materials, but Danielle had grouped them under a single label, unstructured withdrawals." She spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure each phrase sounded reasonable. "I'm not saying Vanessa meant harm," she continued gently, "but her financial situation has been unstable, and that creates risk." Dad frowned. Risk to what, he asked. "To Mom's long-term care," Danielle answered smoothly, "which is why I had to step in. Step in, not intervene, not investigate. Step in." The language mattered, because it framed her actions as protective, not aggressive. Mom looked at me, then confusion clouding her eyes. "Vanessa," she whispered, "why didn't you tell us you were struggling?" That question hurt more than anything Danielle had said, because it revealed how effective her narrative had already become. She hadn't just taken control of the money. She had shifted our parents' perception of me. And perception inside families is incredibly difficult to reverse. I kept my voice steady when I finally spoke. "I never used Mom's funds for personal expenses," I said calmly. Danielle nodded immediately, as if she had expected that response. "Not directly," she agreed, "but unstable income creates indirect risk. That's why I consolidated the funds into a managed portfolio." Her tone was patient, almost sympathetic, like she was explaining something obvious to someone naive. Dad turned to her. "And the money is safe now?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "It's under professional oversight." That statement hung in the air for a moment, because technically it wasn't a complete lie. But it wasn't the truth either. And that's where Danielle was most dangerous. She knew how to live inside that gray space between truth and deception. She slid another document across the table. "This is the authorization I filed to ensure legal protection," she said. Dad picked it up. I didn't reach for it, because I already knew what it contained. The notarized statement accusing me of mismanagement. Dad read silently for a few seconds, then looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" he asked. That question revealed something painful but familiar. He believed her documentation more than my presence, more than my years of care for Mom, more than everything I had quietly done. Danielle watched me carefully, then waiting. She was expecting one of two reactions: anger or desperation. Both would confirm her narrative that I was unstable, so I gave her neither. Instead, I asked one calm question. "When did you first decide I was a risk?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was aggressive, but because it shifted the focus away from numbers and toward intent. She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Over time, she answered vaguely. It became clear the patterns were concerning. Patterns, another strategic word. Neutral, impersonal, deflecting responsibility. I nodded slowly, as if accepting her explanation. And that seemed to relax her, because the next thing she said revealed more than she realized. "I had to act quickly," she continued. "There wasn't time to involve everyone before securing the funds." Act quickly, secure the funds. Both phrases implied urgency, but there had never been urgency. There had only been opportunity, and she had taken it. Mom's voice trembled as she spoke next. Danielle said the money could have disappeared if she didn't move it, she whispered. I looked at Danielle. She held my gaze calmly, confidently, like she believed that statement was unchallengeable. That was the moment I understood exactly how far she had already gone in shaping the narrative. She wasn't just defending her actions. She was positioning herself as the only reason our mother's money still existed at all, which meant if the truth came out now, it wouldn't just expose her. It would emotionally devastate our parents. And that mattered more to me than winning an argument in that living room. So I did something that surprised everyone, including Danielle. I stood up. I understand why you thought you had to do this, I said quietly. The room went completely still, because that wasn't the response anyone expected. Danielle blinked, once clearly thrown off balance. You understand, she repeated. Yes, I said calmly. You were trying to protect Mom. Those words landed like a shield between us. They removed confrontation. They removed hostility. They removed the fight she had prepared for. And without that fight, she didn't know how to proceed. Because Danielle was strongest when she could react to resistance. She was weakest when there was none. Dad exhaled invisible relief. That's all we want, he said, for you two to be on the same page. I nodded. We are, I replied. Danielle stared at me, then something uneasy flickering behind her composed expression. Because my calm acceptance didn't fit her expectations. It didn't match the narrative she had prepared to defend. And for the first time since this began, I saw uncertainty enter her eyes. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that while she had been presenting her documentation that night, a formal institutional audit of her transfers had already been completed earlier that afternoon. And the report had been sent to exactly 3 recipients: the bank's legal compliance division, the external brokerage firm holding the funds, and me. At 9:17 a.m., the morning after the family meeting, I opened the audit report and saw a single line that made my hands go completely still. Unauthorized transfer pattern, consistent with fiduciary misuse. I didn't forward it to anyone. I didn't confront Danielle. I closed the document, saved it into my timeline folder, and went to work grooming a 7-year-old husky that wouldn't stop howling. If you've ever held proof that could destroy someone and realized using it would also shatter your own family, you know how heavy silence can feel. Tell me, honestly, would you have sent that report immediately? Or would you have waited for the right moment? Because that morning, I made a decision that changed the entire trajectory of what happened next. I decided not to act yet. Not because I was unsure, but because the audit report revealed something more complicated than simple wrongdoing. It revealed timing, and timing was everything now. The report was detailed, clinical, impossible to argue with. It listed every transfer Danielle had initiated, including timestamps, authorization levels, and compliance flags. Each entry had a notation in red beside it. User privileges exceeded. It also confirmed something crucial. The brokerage account she moved the money into was not structured as a custodial investment for our mother. It was registered as a personal discretionary account under Danielle's sole management authority. That meant, legally speaking, the money was now sitting in an account she could control independently, which made the situation far more serious than I had initially understood. But one section of the report mattered more than all the others. It was labeled Client Notification Risk. Under it, the compliance department had written, immediate action may trigger rapid fund liquidation or concealment if subject becomes aware of investigation prematurely. That sentence changed everything because it confirmed what I had instinctively sensed all along. If Danielle realized she was under formal scrutiny too early, she might try to move the money again, or hide it, or create new documentation to complicate the trail. And once that happened, recovering, it would become exponentially harder, which meant patience wasn't weakness. It was strategy. I closed the report and sat quietly in my van for several minutes before starting my first appointment of the day. Outside, the Arizona sun was already bright and unforgiving, reflecting off windshields and turning the air sharp with heat. Inside the van, the hum of the grooming dryer filled the silence while I brushed loose fur into a plastic bin. And as I worked, something else began to settle into place in my mind. Danielle's greatest vulnerability wasn't just the unauthorized transfers. It was her belief that she had successfully controlled the narrative within our family. She believed she was safe because she had already convinced our parents she was protecting them. That belief made her confident, and confidence makes people careless. Over the next week, I watched her behavior closely again. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. She became more assertive in family conversations about money. She started discussing future care planning for Mom more openly. She even mentioned the possibility of consolidating all assets under her management long-term. Each time she spoke, she framed it as responsibility, as sacrifice, as stepping up when others couldn't. And each time, our parents listened, without questioning her authority, because in their minds, she had already proven herself. That was the narrative she needed to maintain above all else. So she leaned into it harder. One evening, while helping Mom prepare dinner, Danielle spoke casually about a new investment opportunity she was considering. It could generate an additional 8% annual return, she said, chopping vegetables with practiced ease. Mom nodded approvingly. "You've always been so good with money," she murmured. Danielle smiled softly, but then she said something that made my pulse slow in a very specific way. "I might need to restructure some funds soon to take advantage of it." Restructure. That word wasn't accidental. It meant she was considering moving the money again, which aligned perfectly with the risk warning in the audit report. And that realization told me something critical. The window for quiet recovery was closing. Because once she initiated another transfer, the legal and logistical complexity would multiply dramatically. I didn't react outwardly. I just continued slicing carrots beside her, keeping my voice neutral. "Sounds like a lot of responsibility," I said. She glanced at me briefly, searching my expression again. "It is," she replied. "But someone has to make hard decisions." Someone. Not we. Not us. Her language had shifted completely now. She no longer spoke as part of a shared family structure. She spoke as the sole authority. And that shift revealed something deeper than financial ambition. It revealed identity. Danielle no longer saw herself as helping the family. She saw herself as replacing its decision-making center. That kind of psychological shift doesn't reverse easily. It escalates. 2 days later, something else happened that made the situation even more urgent. I received a follow-up call from Patricia Ellison at the bank. Her tone was still calm, but more direct than before. "Miss Cole," she said, "the brokerage firm has acknowledged the audit findings. They are prepared to freeze the external account immediately upon your formal dispute authorization." Immediately. That word echoed in my mind, because it meant that once I signed the declaration form, Danielle would lose access to the funds instantly. No warning, no preparation, no opportunity to move anything. But Patricia added one more detail that made the decision far more complicated than it seemed. "There is also an option," she said carefully, "to delay the freeze until after a formal notification hearing. Some clients prefer this when family dynamics are involved." A notification hearing. That meant Danielle would be informed in advance that the dispute had been filed. She would have time to prepare her response, possibly even attempt damage control within the family. But it would also create an official record showing that she had been given the opportunity to explain her actions before any enforcement occurred, which mattered legally and emotionally, because it meant the truth wouldn't appear as an ambush. It would appear as due process. I asked Patricia one simple question. If we delay the freeze, how long would the notification period be? 10 business days, she answered. 10 days. 10 days, during which Danielle could still access the funds. 10 days during which she might try to move them. 10 days, during which everything could either stabilize or spiral completely out of control. I ended the call and sat quietly for a long time afterward, because I realized the situation had reached a point where there was no longer a safe option. Only trade-offs. Immediate freeze would protect the money, but shock the family. Delayed notification would preserve transparency, but risk further loss. And while I weighed those choices, Danielle was already making plans of her own, because that same evening she sent another group email to our parents and me with the subject line, "Important announcement, Saturday gathering." Inside, she wrote that she wanted to host a family dinner that weekend to discuss long-term financial planning and share positive updates. Positive updates. That phrase alone told me everything I needed to know. She believed she was about to present something that would strengthen her authority even further, something she was confident enough to reveal publicly. And whatever that announcement was, it meant she had already taken another step with the money. At 7:41 p.m. on Saturday night, Danielle stood in our parents' dining room and announced she had successfully secured a long-term investment agreement worth exactly $248,000 under her sole management authority. I didn't question her in front of everyone. I simply watched her slide a glossy contract across the table, while quietly noticing one small detail she didn't realize would expose everything. If you've ever seen someone proudly present the very evidence that will eventually unravel them, you know how surreal that moment feels. Tell me, would you have stopped her right there, or let her keep talking until she revealed too much? Because that night, Danielle revealed far more than she intended. And she did it with a smile. The dinner looked normal on the surface. Roasted chicken, green beans, our mom's favorite lemon iced tea, sweating in tall glasses. But underneath that ordinary setting, tension hung thick in the air. Danielle was energized, almost glowing with confidence. She had dressed carefully in a cream blazer and subtle gold jewelry that made her look exactly like what she wanted to project confidence, stable, and control. She waited until everyone had finished eating before standing up. "Thank you for trusting me these past months," she began, her tone warm and composed. Our parents looked at her with open pride. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, listening. Danielle opened a black leather portfolio and removed a stack of printed documents bound neatly with a silver clip. "I've finalized a managed investment structure that will protect Mom's assets long-term," she continued. "This ensures stable growth and professional oversight." She placed the contract on the table in front of Dad. "This agreement locks in a projected annual return of 7.5%, she said. "It's the safest option available." Dad leaned forward, scanning the first page with interest. "That sounds responsible," he said slowly. Mom smiled faintly, her eyes soft with relief. "You've always been so organized," she whispered. Danielle's expression softened in response, but there was something sharper behind her eyes, something triumphant, because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about validation. She was securing her position as the family's decision maker, and she believed this contract would make that position permanent. She turned slightly toward me then. "Vanessa, I know this has been difficult for you," she said gently, "but this ensures everything is handled professionally, moving forward." Her tone carried just enough sympathy to sound compassionate, but also enough finality to close the door on any challenge. I nodded calmly. "It's good to see everything documented," I replied. That response seemed to relax her further, because she believed documentation was her strength. She believed paperwork protected her. And in a way, she was right. Documentation does protect people, but only when it's accurate. Dad flipped to the last page of the contract and paused. "There's a management authorization section here," he said. This gives you discretionary control. Yes, Danielle answered smoothly. It's standard. It allows quick decision-making without delays. Standard. The word sounded harmless, but it meant something very specific legally. It meant she could move funds without seeking additional approval each time, which was exactly what she wanted. Mom looked uncertain for a moment. But the money still belongs to me, right? She asked quietly. Of course, Danielle replied immediately. This just ensures it's protected. Protected, the same word she had used from the beginning. But now, hearing it again while watching her body language, her posture, her controlled breathing, her subtle anticipation, I realized something deeper. Danielle wasn't just trying to protect money. She was trying to protect control. Control over decisions, control over narratives, control over how our parents saw both of us. And she was very close to achieving it. She handed Dad a pen. If you sign here, she said we can finalize everything this week. The room went very quiet. Dad held the pen hesitating, not because he doubted Danielle, but because signing meant formally shifting authority. Permanently. I watched his hand carefully, because that moment mattered more than any argument I could make. If he signed, Danielle's legal position would become far more complicated to challenge. But before he could move, something else caught my attention. A small detail in the contract header. A registration date. 3 days earlier. 3 days. That meant Danielle had initiated this agreement immediately after our last family meeting. Before any bank notifications. Before any dispute filings. Before anyone outside the family had intervened, which told me something crucial. She wasn't acting cautiously anymore. She was accelerating, trying to solidify her position before any institutional response could occur. And that acceleration matched exactly what the audit report had warned about. Rapid escalation when the subject senses potential risk. My pulse slowed as I realized something else. The brokerage firm listed in the contract was the same institution that had already acknowledged the audit findings, which meant they were aware of the compliance flags on the account. But Danielle clearly didn't know that, because she wouldn't have presented this agreement so confidently if she had. Dad finally set the pen down. I need to think about this, he said. Danielle's smile tightened slightly. It's time sensitive, she replied carefully. We don't want to miss the market window. Time sensitive. Another pressure tactic. She was trying to create urgency, because urgency reduces scrutiny. That had always been her strategy. But Dad shook his head gently. I just want to review it properly first. Danielle nodded, masking her frustration with practiced grace. Of course, she said, but I saw the brief flicker of irritation in her eyes before it disappeared. That flicker told me everything. She needed this signed quickly, which meant she knew on some level that delays increased her risk. Dinner ended shortly afterward. As we gathered dishes in the kitchen, Danielle moved closer to me. Her voice dropped low so our parents couldn't hear. You've been very calm lately, she said quietly. That's different. I rinsed a plate slowly before answering. I trust you to handle things responsibly, I replied. She studied my face carefully, searching for something. Doubt, suspicion, resistance, but she found none. And that seemed to unsettle her more than any confrontation would have, because calmness removes the signals manipulators rely on to adjust their strategy. She finally smiled faintly. Good, she said, because everything is about to become much more official. Much more official. That phrase lingered in my mind long after I left that night, because she had no idea just how official things were about to become. Earlier that afternoon, while she was preparing her presentation, I had already signed the dispute authorization form, and at exactly 4:02 p.m., the bank had initiated the first stage of a formal asset protection hold. But what Danielle didn't know yet was that the hold wasn't designed to freeze her immediately. It was designed to monitor her next move, and according to the compliance timeline, the next stage would activate automatically the moment she attempted to execute the new investment agreement she had just proudly presented. 3 days after Danielle's announcement dinner at exactly 11:06 a.m., she attempted to execute the new investment transfer for $248,000, and the brokerage system automatically flagged her account with a silent Level 2 compliance hold. She didn't know it yet. She just thought the system was processing slowly. I knew because the bank's alert arrived on my phone while I was kneeling on a client's kitchen floor, trimming the nails of a nervous terrier that wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't react. I finished the trim, cleaned the floor, and drove away like nothing had changed. If you've ever known the exact moment someone's power quietly started slipping, and they had no idea, it feels less like victory and more like watching gravity take over. Tell me honestly, would you have warned her or stayed silent and let consequences unfold naturally? Because from that point on, silence became my most powerful weapon. The compliance alert was short and precise. External discretionary transfer attempt detected. Account status monitored restriction. Further action pending. Monitored restriction. That meant Danielle's account wasn't frozen yet. But every movement from that point forward was being tracked in real time by both institutions. It also meant something else. She could still see the money sitting there, but she could no longer move it freely. In that psychological state, seeing control, but not having it, creates pressure faster than any confrontation ever could. I locked my phone and placed it back in my pocket. The terrier's owner, a quiet woman named Mrs. Kendall, chatted about the weather while I packed my equipment. Outside, the Arizona sun was sharp and relentless, baking the asphalt into shimmering waves. Inside my chest, everything felt strangely calm. Not triumphant, not relieved, just settled. Because the moment Danielle tried to finalize that investment agreement, she had unknowingly triggered a system she couldn't charm, persuade, or outmaneuver. And from that moment forward, the timeline no longer belonged to her. It belonged to institutional process. That afternoon, Danielle called me. Her voice sounded slightly strained, but controlled. "Hey," she said casually. "Have you noticed any delays with the brokerage platform recently?" I leaned against my van, wiping dog hair off my sleeve. "No," I answered evenly. "Why?" "Just some technical issues," she replied quickly. Probably nothing. That phrase revealed everything. She was already trying to reassure herself, trying to interpret the restriction as a temporary glitch, not a compliance action. And that meant she hadn't received any official notice yet, which gave me more time. More time for her to react naturally. More time for her behavior to reveal patterns that would matter later. Over the next few days, I watched her closely again. This time, the change was unmistakable. She became restless, checking her phone constantly, refreshing financial apps repeatedly. Her confidence hadn't vanished, but it had developed small cracks. Subtle signs of uncertainty she couldn't fully hide. At dinner one evening, she casually mentioned market volatility. "Sometimes transactions take longer during compliance reviews," she said almost defensively. No one had asked, which meant the explanation wasn't for us. It was for herself. Mom nodded sympathetically. "These systems are so complicated," she murmured. Danielle forced a smile. "Yes, but everything is under control." Under control. She kept repeating that phrase over the next week, and each time she said it, it sounded slightly less convincing, even to her own ears. Because control is something you feel, not something you need to insist on. About 6 days after the transfer attempt, the first visible shift occurred. Danielle's tone toward me changed. Not openly hostile, but sharper, more probing. One night, while we washed dishes together, she spoke quietly, without looking at me. "You've been very detached lately," she said. I dried a plate slowly before answering. "I've just been focusing on work," I replied. She studied my face carefully then. "You're not worried about Mom's finances anymore?" she asked. The question wasn't casual. It was testing. She was trying to gauge whether I knew something. I met her gaze calmly. "I trust that everything is being handled responsibly, I said. The words were neutral, but they carried a weight she couldn't quite interpret. And that uncertainty unsettled her, because manipulators rely on predictable emotional responses to maintain control. When those responses disappear, they lose their ability to calibrate their behavior. She looked away first. "Good," she said quietly, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. That was when I realized something important. Danielle's greatest fear wasn't being caught. It was losing narrative dominance, because if she lost control of how people perceived her, her entire sense of authority would collapse. 2 days later, the second compliance phase activated. I knew because another alert arrived early that morning. This one was more direct. Client notification pending. Formal inquiry letter scheduled for delivery within 72 hours. 72 hours. That meant Danielle would soon receive official written notice questioning her transfer authority. Once that letter arrived, everything would shift irreversibly. Because institutional language doesn't leave room for storytelling. It presents facts, and facts disrupt narratives faster than anything else. I spent the rest of that day working as usual, driving between clients, washing dogs, answering scheduling calls. Externally, nothing about my life had changed. But internally, something felt very different now. The quiet waiting phase was ending. The systems were moving forward on their own timeline. And soon, Danielle would no longer be able to interpret events as technical delays or temporary inconveniences. She would have to face the reality of what she had set in motion. That evening, while scrolling through social media before bed, I saw something unexpected. Danielle had posted a photo. It showed her sitting at a rooftop restaurant, smiling, holding a glass of wine. The caption read, "Big moves require big courage. Some people won't understand until it's too late." That line lingered in my mind long after I put my phone down, because it revealed something profound about her mindset. She still believed she was the protagonist of her own story. Still believed she was acting bravely. Still believed anyone who questioned her simply didn't understand her vision. And that belief meant when the official letter arrived, she wouldn't respond with immediate fear. She would respond with denial. And denial always leads to one predictable next stage: escalation. Because Danielle had no idea yet that the inquiry letter wasn't the only document already on its way to her mailbox. At 8:52 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning in late January, Danielle received 2 envelopes in her mailbox, one marked Compliance Inquiry and the other marked Legal Notice, Signature Required. She opened the compliance letter first. I know, because she called me exactly 14 minutes later, her voice tight in a way I had never heard before. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring twice, then picked up. If you've ever watched someone shift from confidence to uncertainty in real time, you know how quickly denial can unravel. Tell me when someone who once held power over you suddenly sounds afraid. Would you feel satisfaction or something more complicated? Because in that moment, what I felt wasn't victory. It was clarity. The kind that comes when a long, quiet timeline finally reaches the point where it can no longer be reversed. Vanessa Danielle said, skipping any greeting, "Did you contact the bank about Mom's account?" Her voice was controlled, but there was a thin edge of urgency beneath it. I leaned against the counter in my kitchen, keeping my tone calm. "They contacted me," I answered truthfully. There was a short silence, then a sharp exhale. "They're questioning the transfer authorization," she said quickly. "It's just routine compliance. Happens all the time." Routine. That word told me she was still trying to frame the situation as minor, still trying to maintain psychological control over the narrative, even if only for herself. "What did the letter say exactly?" I asked quietly. Another pause, longer this time. "It just says they need clarification," she replied. "They probably flagged the large amount automatically." "Probably," Another self-reassuring word. But then her voice shifted slightly, and there was another envelope she added. From some legal office. It says, I have to sign for it. There it was, the second letter, the one she hadn't opened yet, because she already sensed it was more serious. I didn't respond right away, and that silence made her speak again faster this time. This is ridiculous, she said. I was authorized to protect the funds. You know that. I kept my voice even. You were authorized to monitor the account, I said calmly. The distinction hung in the air between us. Monitor, not transfer, not control, just monitor. She didn't respond immediately, because for the first time since this began, she was hearing the language framed exactly as institutions would frame it. Precise, unemotional, irrefutable. When she spoke again, her tone carried a new edge, defensive now. I did what needed to be done, she said. You weren't capable of managing long-term investments. There it was, the shift from reassurance to justification. A predictable stage, because once denial weakens, people often move directly into rationalization. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just said one quiet sentence. The bank's audit report is very detailed. Silence. Complete silence. I could almost hear her mind recalculating. Audit report? That phrase meant she now understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just a routine inquiry. It was an investigation with documented findings. Her breathing became slightly audible through the phone. Did you file a dispute? She asked slowly. I answered simply, yes. No explanation, no emotion, just a fact. And that single word shifted everything between us, because it confirmed what she had feared, but hadn't allowed herself to believe until that moment. For the first time since she moved the money, she was no longer controlling the situation. The call ended shortly afterward. Not with an argument, not with a threat, just a quiet, abrupt goodbye. And that abruptness told me more than any angry reaction could have. It meant she was retreating internally, trying to regain footing, trying to plan her next move. Because Danielle had never handled loss of control well. Her entire identity depended on being the one who understood systems better than others. Now she was facing a system she couldn't influence. And that would push her into the next predictable stage. Escalation through narrative. That evening, she came to our parents' house, unexpectedly. I was already there, helping Mom organize her medication schedule. Danielle walked in quickly, still holding the unopened legal envelope in her hand. Her posture was rigid, her composure strained. I need to talk to everyone, she said firmly. Dad looked up from his chair, concerned. What's wrong? Danielle hesitated for a moment. Then she spoke in a measured but urgent tone. The bank is questioning the account transfers, she said, because Vanessa filed a dispute. The room went very still. Mom looked confused. Dad's eyes shifted toward me. You reported your sister? He asked slowly. The word reported carried heavy weight. Not investigated, not clarified, reported. I met his gaze calmly. I requested an audit review, I said. Danielle stepped forward, her voice rising slightly now. She's making it sound like I did something illegal, she said quickly. But I was protecting Mom's money. There it was, the return to her core narrative. Protection, responsibility, sacrifice, because she needed our parents to stay aligned with her version of events. Dad frowned. Why didn't you just discuss this together? First, he asked. That question revealed something painful but familiar. He still saw this as a family disagreement, not a legal matter. And Danielle leaned into that perception immediately. Because she doesn't trust me, she said quietly, her voice softening into something that almost sounded hurt. That was the next predictable stage. Victim positioning, and it worked, at least partially. Mom reached for her hand. I know you were trying to help, she whispered. Danielle's eyes filled with tears instantly. Not dramatic tears, controlled ones. The kind that reinforce vulnerability without losing composure. I just wanted to make sure you were safe, she said. Safe, always that word. But as I watched her standing there, clutching the unopened legal envelope, something else became clear to me. she still didn't fully understand the severity of what was coming. Because the compliance letter was only the beginning. The legal notice in her hand, the one she hadn't opened yet, contained a formal request for a documented response hearing. And once she signed for that letter, the timeline would shift from internal review to public accountability. At 3:18 p.m., 2 days after the letters arrived, Danielle finally signed for the legal envelope, and the document inside scheduled a formal response hearing exactly 21 days later at the Maricopa County Financial Dispute Review Board. She didn't tell her parents immediately, but she called me within 10 minutes of opening it, her voice no longer tight with denial, just very, very controlled. I let the phone ring once before answering, because by then, I already knew what the letter contained. If you've ever watched someone realize they can no longer keep a conflict private, that the truth is about to move into a public setting, you know how quickly confidence turns into calculation. Tell me honestly, when accountability becomes unavoidable, do people change or just become more desperate? Because that afternoon, I heard the exact moment Danielle shifted from defensive to strategic. "Vanessa," she said calmly, almost too calmly, "we need to talk before this goes any further. Not argue, not explain, talk." That single word revealed everything. She had finally accepted one critical reality. This was no longer a narrative she could manage alone. She needed negotiation, or at least she believed she did. I stayed quiet for a moment before answering. "I'm listening," I said. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear her breathing, steadying, deliberately. "They've scheduled a hearing," she continued. "It's a formal review process, not a court case. But it can escalate if we don't resolve this internally first." Escalate? That word carried weight now, because she had finally read the legal language carefully. She knew this could move beyond administrative review into civil liability or even criminal referral if findings confirmed unauthorized control. "I don't want this to damage the family," she said softly. That was the first time she had framed the risk in those terms. Not reputation, not money, family, because she understood something very clearly now. Once a public hearing happened, the truth wouldn't just exist in documentation. It would exist in testimony. And testimony changes how people see each other permanently. I leaned against my kitchen counter, speaking evenly. "What are you asking?" Another pause. Then she said, the words I had known were coming. "I'm asking you to withdraw the dispute," she said quietly. There it was, the simplest possible solution from her perspective. Remove the trigger, stop the process, restore control. But the moment she said it, something else became clear. She still didn't fully understand what the dispute process had already uncovered, because at that stage, withdrawal wouldn't erase the audit findings. It would only stop enforcement action. The documentation would still exist. The institutional record would remain, and any future financial oversight at request would surface it again, which meant the past could no longer be undone, only managed. I didn't respond immediately, and that silence made her speak again faster now. "I can restructure the funds properly," she continued. "We can move them back into a custodial account under Mom's name. Everything can be corrected. Corrected, not reversed." Because even she knew reversal wasn't possible anymore. What she was offering was damage control, a way to preserve the family narrative while avoiding institutional consequences. And that offer revealed something else. She was afraid, not panicking, but genuinely afraid now, because she had finally reached the stage where she could see outcomes she couldn't control. I spoke quietly. "Why didn't you do that from the beginning?" The question wasn't accusatory, just direct. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was lower. "I thought I could manage it better," she admitted. That was the closest she had come to honesty since this began. Not a full admission, but a crack in the narrative. Because beneath all her justifications, protection, responsibility, urgency, the real motivation had always been control. And she was finally acknowledging that, at least indirectly. "Danielle," I said calmly, "this process isn't only about the money anymore." She knew that, but hearing it spoken aloud shifted something in the conversation, because it forced her to confront what she had been trying to avoid. This was about trust, about authority, about the role she had assigned herself inside our family. And once those issues surfaced publicly, they couldn't be quietly repaired. Her voice tightened slightly. "What do you want then?" she asked. Not angrily, just tired, because for the first time, she didn't have a prepared narrative to rely on. I answered simply, "I want the truth documented." Silence, heavy, unmistakable silence. Because that request couldn't be negotiated. It couldn't be reframed. It couldn't be softened. Truth documented meant facts recorded officially. It meant timelines preserved. It meant accountability defined clearly, not emotionally. And that was exactly what Danielle had been trying to avoid since the beginning. She exhaled slowly. "If this goes to a hearing," she said quietly, "it will become public record." Public record. Those words mattered deeply to her. Because public records don't just affect legal outcomes. They affect reputations, careers, future opportunities. And Danielle's entire identity depended on being seen as competent and trustworthy. I didn't respond because she already understood the implications. The conversation ended shortly afterward, not with resolution, just with a quiet, mutual awareness that the situation had crossed a point of no return. 2 days later, she told our parents about the hearing. The reaction was exactly what I expected. Shock, confusion, fear. Dad paced the living room, struggling to reconcile the sister he trusted with the formal language of legal inquiry. Mom cried quietly, repeating the same question over and over. Why couldn't this stay private? Danielle answered that question carefully, not by denying the process, but by reframing its cause. "This only happened because Vanessa didn't trust me," she said softly. And that statement shifted the emotional burden exactly where she wanted it. From her actions to my response, it was a subtle but powerful narrative move, one she had practiced her entire life. But this time, something was different. Because unlike before, the truth no longer existed only inside family conversations. It existed in documented timelines, signed audit reports, and a scheduled public hearing where both evidence and testimony would be presented side by side. And what Danielle still didn't know yet was that the hearing wouldn't just include financial documentation. It would include witness statements from 2 individuals she had never considered part of this story at all. At 9:02 a.m. on the morning of the hearing, exactly $248,000 still sat frozen in Danielle's brokerage account. And for the first time in her life, she walked into a public room where her confidence couldn't change the outcome. I arrived 12 minutes early, carrying nothing but a thin folder and a bottle of water. She arrived 7 minutes later, dressed in a navy suit, holding a leather portfolio thick enough to look impressive from across the room. If you've ever watched someone prepare to defend a version of reality they've lived inside for months, only to realize the setting won't allow storytelling, you know how quickly composure can crack. Tell me, honestly, do you think truth hurts more when it's spoken privately, or when it's spoken where everyone can hear it? Because that day, the truth wasn't whispered. It was documented. The Maricopa County Financial Dispute Review Board wasn't a courtroom, but it felt close enough. Neutral beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a long table where 3 panel members sat with laptops open and name placards aligned perfectly in front of them. No dramatic tension, no raised voices, just process, structured, methodical, unemotional, which made it far more powerful than any family confrontation ever could have been. Danielle took a seat across from me, her posture straight, her expression calm, but her fingers kept adjusting the edge of her portfolio. A small tell, one I had noticed since childhood. Whenever she felt uncertain, She avoided looking at me at first. Instead, she focused on the panel members, as if they were clients she needed to impress. Because that was her instinct. When in doubt, present confidence. Control the narrative, lead the conversation. But this wasn't a conversation she could lead. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the lead reviewer, a gray-haired man named Robert Keating, began the session. This is a formal response hearing regarding disputed fiduciary transfer authority, he said evenly. His tone was neutral, almost detached. He wasn't interested in family dynamics. He was interested in documentation, and that distinction changed everything immediately. He turned first to Danielle. Miss Danielle Marie Cole, he said you are listed as a secondary, authorized user on the original account. Can you confirm that you initiated the transfer of funds totaling $212, 430.62 on December 22nd? Danielle's voice remained steady. Yes, she answered. I acted to protect the account holder's financial stability. Protect. She held onto that word like a shield. Robert nodded without reacting. Were you granted transfer authority by the primary account manager? He asked. A pause. Only 2 seconds. But it was the first visible hesitation since the hearing began. I believed I had implicit authority to act in the account holder's best interest, she replied carefully. Implicit authority, not documented authority. The difference mattered, and everyone in that room knew it. Robert typed something into his laptop before speaking again. The audit report indicates that the authorization structure explicitly limited your privileges to monitoring and administrative assistance. Do you dispute that finding? Danielle's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her portfolio. No, she said quietly. That single word shifted the room's energy instantly, because it was the first clear acknowledgement that her authority had limits she exceeded. From that moment forward, the discussion moved away from interpretation and into fact confirmation. The second panel member, a woman named Lisa Patel, spoke next. Miss Cole, she said calmly, after transferring the funds, you moved them into a discretionary investment account under your sole management authorization. Can you explain why this structure was chosen? Danielle's voice regained some firmness. It allowed faster decision-making and better investment flexibility, she said. Was the account holder listed as a co-beneficiary? Lisa asked. Another pause. No, Danielle admitted, and that answer landed heavily in the quiet room, because it confirmed what the audit report had already documented. The funds were no longer under shared oversight. They were under her exclusive control. That was the moment Danielle's posture shifted subtly, not collapsing, but tightening, because she realized the panel wasn't debating intentions. They were establishing control structures, and control structures are binary. Either you have authority or you don't. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, moving through timelines, documentation, and authorization records. Danielle answered every question calmly, but each answer narrowed her position further. Until finally, Robert Keating turned toward me. Miss Vanessa Cole, he said you filed the dispute request on January 4th. Can you confirm that you did not authorize the transfer in question? Yes, I said simply. No elaboration, no emotion, just a fact. He nodded. And can you confirm that prior to the transfer, no written or verbal consent was provided, granting Miss Danielle Cole discretionary control over the account funds? That's correct, I answered. He typed again, then paused. For the record, he said, we also have supporting testimony from 2 external witnesses regarding the account management structure. Danielle's head lifted slightly at that sentence, because she hadn't expected witnesses. Her eyes moved quickly between the panel members, uncertainty flashing for the first time in full view. Robert continued, the first statement is from Patricia Ellison, Senior Account Manager at Southwest Federal Bank, confirming the authorization limits and timeline of compliance flags. Danielle's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. The second statement, Robert added, is from Mr. Douglas Hartman, former CPA, who assisted Miss Vanessa Cole in documenting account transaction patterns during the audit review. That name landed like a quiet shock in the room, because Danielle had never considered him part of the situation at all. To her, he had been just another elderly client of mine. Invisible, irrelevant, but systems notice patterns that people overlook, and Mr. Hartman had recognized the irregularities long before Danielle realized anyone was watching. For the first time since the hearing began, Danielle's composure visibly cracked, only slightly, but enough. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. Her breathing slowed as if she were recalibrating internally, because she finally understood something that changed everything about how she saw the situation. This was no longer a narrative she could reshape. It was a documented sequence of actions, confirmed by independent verification. And once documentation reaches that level, the final stage becomes unavoidable, because the next question the panel would ask would no longer be about what happened. It would be about what consequences followed. At exactly 10:43 a.m., after 91 minutes of questioning, the lead reviewer closed his laptop and said the one sentence Danielle had been trying to avoid since the beginning. The panel has reached a preliminary determination regarding fiduciary misuse. No one spoke for several seconds. Not me, not Danielle, not even the other panel members, because that phrase didn't just describe what she had done. It defined it. If you've ever heard a single line that instantly changes how a person is seen, from trusted to accountable, you know how quiet a room can become in that moment. Tell me honestly, when someone finally faces consequences, do you think they feel regret first or disbelief? Because what I saw on Danielle's face in that moment wasn't guilt. It was shock, not loud shock, not dramatic, just a subtle frozen stillness, as if her mind couldn't immediately process a reality where her authority no longer mattered. Robert Keating continued speaking in the same neutral tone. Based on documented authorization limits, transfer records, and external account structuring, he said the panel finds that the disputed funds were moved without proper fiduciary authority. He paused briefly before adding the next part. This constitutes a breach of financial duty under administrative review guidelines. Breach, duty, guidelines. The language was precise, unemotional, and irreversible, because once those words entered official record, they couldn't be reframed or softened later. Danielle's fingers tightened around the edge of her portfolio until her knuckles turned pale. For a moment, it looked like she might speak, like she might argue or defend herself. But nothing came out, because for the first time in her life, she had reached a situation where persuasion was irrelevant. Facts had already spoken. Lisa Patel leaned forward slightly. As part of this determination, she said calmly, the panel will recommend immediate reclassification of the funds into a protected custodial structure under the original account holder. That meant one thing very clearly. Danielle would lose all control over the money permanently. Not temporarily, not conditionally, permanently. Her eyes flickered toward me then, just for a second, and in that brief glance, I saw something I had never seen in her before. Not anger, not pride, not calculation, just realization, because she finally understood what this process had truly taken from her. Not just money, not just authority, but narrative dominance. She could no longer claim she had acted responsibly. She could no longer position herself as the family's protector. That identity had been dismantled quietly, officially, and publicly. Robert continued. The panel also notes that no evidence supports claims of financial mismanagement by the primary account manager. That line mattered more than anything else, he said, because it erased the narrative Danielle had built against me. Not emotionally, not privately, but formally, which meant it would exist in record permanently. I didn't react outwardly. I just sat quietly, letting the words settle. Because vindication doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels quiet. Like a tension you didn't fully realize you were carrying, finally releasing. Danielle finally spoke then. Her voice was steady, but softer than I had ever heard it. "I never intended to harm anyone," she said. The sentence sounded almost rehearsed, not because it was false, but because it came too late. Intentions don't change documented actions. Lisa Patel nodded politely. "The panel recognizes your stated intent," she replied. "However, fiduciary standards are determined by authority structures, not personal motivations." That sentence closed the last door Danielle had been trying to keep open, because it clarified something fundamental. This process wasn't judging her character. It was evaluating her actions, and actions have consequences, regardless of intention. Robert spoke again, his tone still even. "The case will not be referred for criminal investigation at this time, as the funds remain recoverable, and no evidence of concealment has been found." That was the first moment Danielle visibly exhaled in relief, because she had clearly feared that outcome most of all. But Robert wasn't finished. However, he continued, "This determination will remain on administrative record and may impact future financial authorization privileges." That line landed heavily, because it meant long-term consequences, not dramatic ones, but permanent ones. Danielle would never again be able to present herself professionally as someone trusted with discretionary financial control, and for someone whose identity depended on competence and authority. That loss cut deeper than any financial penalty. The hearing concluded shortly afterward. No applause, no confrontation, just signatures, documentation, and quiet procedural closure. Danielle gathered her papers slowly. Her movements were precise, but slower now, as if each action required more effort than before. When she finally stood, she didn't look at me immediately. She walked toward the exit first, then stopped, turned, and met my eyes. There was no anger there, no accusation, just something unfamiliar. Acceptance. Not full, not comfortable, but unmistakable. She opened her mouth slightly, like she might say something. But after a moment, she simply nodded once and left the room. I remained seated for another minute, letting the quiet settle around me, because the process wasn't over yet. The panel's determination had resolved the financial dispute, but the emotional consequences inside our family were only beginning. And later that evening, when I returned to our parents' house, I would learn that Danielle had already taken one final step that none of us had expected. 3 weeks after the hearing, on a quiet Sunday morning in early March, Danielle transferred exactly $248,000 back into a protected custodial account under our mother's name, and then left our parents' house without saying goodbye. She didn't slam the door. She didn't argue. She just set her house key on the kitchen counter and walked out quietly. I watched her car disappear down the street, through the living room window, feeling something that wasn't anger and wasn't relief either. It was something calmer than both. Closure. Before I tell you what happened after she left and why that quiet ending mattered more than any dramatic confrontation, let me ask you something. When someone finally faces the consequences of their choices, do you think justice is about punishment or about boundaries? Because what I learned from everything that happened wasn't how to win. It was how to stop fighting altogether. The transfer happened exactly as the panel recommended. The funds were placed into a custodial trust structure managed by a third-party fiduciary service. No family member, including me, had discretionary control anymore. Everything required documented approval, oversight, and compliance review, which meant something very simple but very important. The system, not people, would protect my mother's future moving forward. And that was always what I had wanted. Not control, just stability. When the official confirmation email arrived, I was sitting in my grooming van, parked outside a client's home, brushing loose fur from the floor. The same ordinary setting where this entire timeline had quietly unfolded. I stared at the email for a long time before closing it, because the feeling wasn't victory. It was stillness. Like a long, invisible tension inside my chest had finally loosened. Later that afternoon, I went to our parents' house to help Mom organize her medication and weekly schedule, just like I always had. The house felt unusually quiet. Dad sat at the dining table, staring at a folded piece of paper. Mom was resting in her chair, her hands trembling slightly, but her expression calm. "She left this," Dad said quietly when I walked in. He handed me the paper. It was a short letter, written in Danielle's precise, controlled handwriting. It didn't contain excuses. It didn't contain arguments. It contained something much simpler. Acknowledgement. I thought control meant protection, she had written. I understand now that trust can't exist without limits. I need time to learn who I am, without needing to manage everything. The words were careful, not emotional, but honest in a way I had never heard from her before. At the bottom, she added one final line. "I hope someday we can speak without needing to prove anything to each other." I folded the letter slowly and placed it back on the table. Neither Dad nor Mom spoke for a long moment, because all of us understood something at the same time. Danielle's departure wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a withdrawal from conflict, from control, from the role she had built her identity around for years. And that kind of change doesn't happen quickly. It happens quietly. Over time, in the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Mom's care became more structured, supported by professional oversight rather than family assumptions. Dad stopped trying to mediate conflicts that no longer existed. And I continued my work exactly as before, driving my van, washing dogs, answering scheduling calls. From the outside, nothing about my life looked extraordinary, but inside, everything felt lighter, because I no longer carried the invisible burden of being misunderstood. The truth existed now, in documentation, in record, in quiet clarity, that no one could rewrite. One evening, about 2 months later, I received a brief message from Danielle. No dramatic apology, no emotional explanation, just a simple sentence. "I started seeing a financial ethics counselor. I'm learning more than I expected." I stared at the message for a long time before replying, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I realized something important in that moment. Forgiveness isn't always about restoring closeness. Sometimes it's about accepting distance peacefully. So I sent a short response. "I hope you find what you're looking for. Nothing more, nothing less." And that was enough, because the purpose of everything that had happened was never revenge. It was clarity. Clarity about boundaries. Clarity about responsibility. Clarity about who I was when I stopped trying to be understood by someone who needed control more than connection. One quiet afternoon, near the end of spring, I sat in my van, parked beside a small desert park after finishing a long day of work. The sky stretched wide in pale blue above me. A warm breeze moved softly through the open window, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and sun-warmed earth. For the first time in months, there were no emails waiting, no alerts, no timelines to track, just silence, peaceful, uncomplicated silence. And in that stillness, I realized something that felt like the final truth of the entire story. Real power isn't proving someone wrong. It's no longer needing to prove anything at all. That sentence stayed with me long after I drove home that evening, because it marked the moment I truly let go, not just of the conflict, but of the need for validation from someone who had never been able to offer it. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced betrayal, quiet injustice, or the painful process of setting boundaries within your own family, tell me in the comments what helped you find peace. And if you want to hear another story about the moment someone underestimated the quietest person in the room, you might want to stay for the next one, because sometimes the calmest voices carry the sharpest truths.